From 2 miles out, the assault troops began to see the living and the dead in the water. The dead floated gently, moving with the tide toward the beach, as though determined to join their fellow Americans. The living bobbed up and down in the swells, savagely pleading for the help the assault boats could not tender. Sergeant Regis McCloskey, his ammunition boat again safely underway, saw the screaming men in the water, yelling for help, begging us to stop, and we couldn't, not for anything or anyone. Gritting his teeth, McCloskey looked away as his boat sped past, and then, seconds later, he vomited over the side. Captain Robert Cunningham and his men saw survivors struggling too. Instinctively their Navy crew swung the boat toward the men in the water. A fast launch cut them off. Over its loudspeaker came the grim words, "You are not a rescue ship. Get on shore." In another boat nearby, Sergeant Noel Doob of an engineer battalion said the act of contrition. Now the deadly martial music of the bombardment seemed to grow and swell as the thin wavy lines of assault craft closed in on Omaha Beach. Landing ships lying about 1,000 yards offshore joined in the shelling, and then thousands of flashing rockets whooshed over the heads of the men. To the troops it seemed inconceivable that anything could survive the massive weight of firepower that flayed the German defenses. The beach was wreathed in haze, and plumes of smoke from grass fires drifted lazily down from the bluffs. Still the German guns remained silent. The boats bored in. In the thrashing surf and running back up the beach, men could now see the lethal jungles of steel and concrete obstacles. They were strewn everywhere, draped with barbed wire and capped with mines. They were as cruel and ugly as the men had expected. Back of the defenses, the beach itself was deserted. Nothing and no one moved upon it. Closer and closer the boats pressed in. 500 yards, 450 yards. Still no enemy fire. Through waves that were 4 to 5 feet high, the assault craft surged forward, and now the great bombardment began to lift, shifting to targets farther inland. The first boats were barely 400 yards from the shore when the German guns, the guns that few believed could have survived the raging Allied air and sea bombardment, opened up. Through the din and clamor, one sound was nearer, deadlier than all the rest. The sound of machine gun bullets clanging across the steel, snout-like noses of the boats. Artillery roared, mortar shells rained down. All along the 4 miles of Omaha Beach, German guns flayed the assault craft. It was H-hour. They came ashore on Omaha Beach, the slogging, unglamorous men that no one envied. No battle ensigns flew for them, no horns or bugles sounded. But they had history on their side. They came from regiments that had bivouacked at places like Valley Forge, Stony Creek, Antietam, Gettysburg, that had fought in the Argonne. They had crossed the beaches of North Africa, Sicily, and Salerno. Now they had one more beach to cross. They would call this one Bloody Omaha. The most intense fire came from the cliffs and high bluffs at either end of the crescent-shaped beach, in the 29th Division's Dog Green area to the west, and the 1st Division's Fox Green sector to the east. Here the Germans had concentrated their heaviest defenses to hold 2 of the principal exits leading off the beach at Vierville and toward Colville. Everywhere along the beach men encountered heavy fire as their boats came in, but the troops landing at Dog Green and Fox Green hadn't a chance. German gunners on the cliffs looked almost directly down on the waterlogged assault craft that heaved and pitched toward these sectors of the beach. Awkward and slow, the assault boats were nearly stationary in the water. They were sitting ducks. Coxswains at the tillers, trying desperately to maneuver their unwieldy craft through the forest of mined obstacles, now had to run the gauntlet of fire from the cliffs. Some boats, unable to find a way through the maze of obstacles and the withering cliff fire, were driven off and wandered aimlessly along the beach, seeking a less heavily defended spot to land. Others, doggedly trying to come in at their assigned sectors, were shelled so badly that men plunged over the sides into deep water, where they were immediately picked off by machine gun fire. Some landing craft were blown apart as they came in. Second Lieutenant Edward Gearing's assault boat, filled with 30 men of the 29th Division, disintegrated in one blinding moment 300 yards from the Vierville exit at Dog Green. Gearing and his men were blown out of the boat and strewn over the water. Shocked and half-drowned, the 19-year-old lieutenant came to the surface yards away from where his boat had gone down. Other survivors began to bob up too. Their weapons, helmets, and equipment were gone. The coxswain had disappeared, and nearby one of Gearing's men, struggling beneath the weight of a heavy radio set strapped to his back, screamed out, "For God's sake, I'm drowning!" Nobody could get to the radio man before he went under. For Gearing and the remnants of his section, the ordeal was just beginning. It would be 3 hours before they got on the beach. Then Gearing would learn that he was the only surviving officer of his company. The others were dead or seriously wounded. All along Omaha Beach, the dropping of the ramp seemed to be the signal for renewed, more concentrated machine gun fire, and again the most murderous fire was in the Dog Green and Fox Green sectors. Boats of the 29th Division coming into Dog Green grounded on the sandbars. The ramps came down and men stepped out into water 3 to 6 feet deep. They had but one object in mind, to get through the water, cross 200 yards of the obstacle-strewn sand, climb the gradually rising shingle, and then take cover in the doubtful shelter of a sea-wall. But weighed down by their equipment, unable to run in the deep water and without cover of any kind, men were caught in crisscrossing machine gun and small arms fire. Seasick men, already exhausted by the long hours spent on the transports and the assault boats, found themselves fighting for their lives in water which was often over their heads. Private David Silver saw the men in front of him being mowed down as they stepped off the ramp. When his turn came, he jumped into chest-high water and, bogged down by his equipment, watched spellbound as bullets flicked the surface all around him. Within seconds, machine gun fire had riddled his pack, his clothing, and his canteen. Silver felt like a pigeon at a trap chute. He thought he spotted the German machine gunner who was firing at him, but he could not fire back. His rifle was clogged with sand. Silver waded on, determined to make the sands ahead. He finally pulled himself up on the beach and dashed for the shelter of the sea wall, completely unaware that he had been wounded twice, once in the back and once in the right leg. Men fell all along the water's edge. Some were killed instantly, others called pitifully for the medics as the incoming tide slowly engulfed them. Among the dead was Captain Sherman Burrows. His friend Captain Charles Cawthon saw the body washing back and forth in the surf. Cawthon wondered if Burrows had recited the shooting of Dan McGrew to his men on the run-in as he had planned. And when Captain Carroll Smith passed by, he could not help but think that Burrows would no longer suffer from his constant migraine headaches. Burrows had been shot through the head. Within the first few minutes of the carnage at Dog Green, one entire company was put out of action. Less than a third of the men survived the bloody walk from the boats to the edge of the beach. Their officers were killed, severely wounded or missing, and the men, weaponless and shocked, huddled at the base of the cliffs all day. Another company in the same sector suffered even higher casualties. Company C of the 2nd Ranger Battalion had been ordered to knock out enemy strongpoints at Pointe de la Percée, slightly west of Vierville. The Rangers landed in 2 assault craft with the first wave on Dog Green. They were decimated. The lead craft was sunk almost immediately by artillery fire, and 12 men were killed outright. The moment the raft of the 2nd craft dropped down, machine gun fire sprayed the debarking Rangers, killing and wounding 15. The remainder set out for the cliffs. Men fell one after another. Private First Class Nelson Noyes, staggering under the weight of a bazooka, made 100 yards before he was forced to hit the ground. A few moments later he got up and ran forward again. When he reached the shingle he was machine-gunned in the leg. As he lay there, Noyes saw the 2 Germans who had fired looking down on him from the cliff. Propping himself on his elbows, he opened up with his Tommy gun and brought both of them down. By the time Captain Ralph E. Goranson, the company commander, reached the base of the cliff, he had only 35 Rangers left out of his 70-man team. By nightfall, these 35 would be cut down to 12. Misfortune piled upon misfortune for the men of Omaha Beach. Soldiers now discovered that they had been landed in the wrong sectors. Some came in almost 2 miles away from their original landing areas. Boat sections from the 29th Division found themselves intermingled with men of the 1st Division. For example, units scheduled to land on Easy Green and fight toward an exit at Les Moulins discovered themselves at the eastern end of the beach in the hell of Fox Green. Nearly all the landing craft came in slightly east of their touchdown points. A control boat drifting off station, a strong current running eastward along the beach, the haze and smoke from grass fires which obscured landmarks, all these contributed to the mislandings. Companies that had been trained to capture certain objectives never got near them. Small groups found themselves pinned down by German fire and isolated in unrecognizable terrain, often without officers or communications. The Special Army-Navy demolition engineers who had the job of blowing paths through the beach obstacles were not only widely scattered, they were brought in crucial minutes behind schedule. These frustrated men set to work wherever they found themselves, but they fought a losing battle. In the few minutes they had before the following waves of troops bore down on the beaches, the engineers cleared only 5½ paths instead of the 16 planned. Working with desperate haste, the demolition parties were impeded at every turn. Infantrymen waded in among them, soldiers took shelter behind the obstacles they were about to blow, and landing craft, buffeted by the swells, came in almost on top of them. Sergeant Barton A. Davis of the 299th Engineer Combat Battalion saw an assault boat bearing down on him. It was filled with 1st Division men and was coming straight in through the obstacles. There was a tremendous explosion, and the boat disintegrated. It seemed to Davis that everyone in it was thrown into the air all at once. Bodies and parts of bodies landed all around the flaming wreckage. I saw black dots of men trying to swim through the gasoline that had spread on the water, and as we wondered what to do, a headless torso flew a good 50 feet through the air and landed with a sickening thud near us. Davis did not see how anyone could have lived through the explosion, but 2 men did. They were pulled out of the water, badly burned but alive. But the disaster that Davis had seen was no greater than that which had overtaken the heroic men of his own unit, the Army-Navy Special Engineer Task Force. The landing boats carrying their explosives had been shelled, and the hulks of these craft lay blazing at the edge of the beach. Engineers with small rubber boats loaded with plastic charges and detonators were blown apart in the water when enemy fire touched off the explosives. The Germans, seeing the engineers working among the obstacles, seemed to single them out for special attention. As the teams tied on their charges, snipers took careful aim at the mines on the obstacles. At other times they seemed to wait until the engineers had prepared whole lines of steel trestles and tetrahedra obstacles for blowing. Then the Germans themselves would detonate the obstacles with mortar fire before the engineers could get out of the area. By the end of the day, casualties would be almost 50%. Sergeant Davis himself would be one. Nightfall would find him aboard a hospital ship with a wounded leg, heading back for England. It was 7 a.m. The second wave of troops arrived on the shambles that was Omaha Beach. Men splashed ashore under the saturating fire of the enemy. Landing craft joined the ever-growing graveyard of wrecked, blazing hulks. Each wave of boats gave up its own bloody contribution to the incoming tide, and all along the crescent-shaped strip of beach, dead Americans gently nudged each other in the water. Piling up along the shore was the flotsam and jetsam of the invasion. Heavy equipment and supplies, boxes of ammunition, smashed radios, field telephones, gas masks, entrenching tool, canteens, steel helmets and life preservers were strewn everywhere. Great reels of wire, ropes, ration boxes, mine detectors, and scores of weapons. From broken rifles to stove-in bazookas littered the sand. The twisted wrecks of landing craft canted up crazily out of the water. Burning tanks threw great spirals of black smoke into the air. Bulldozers lay on their sides among the obstacles. Off Easy Red, floating in and out among all the cast-off materials of war, men saw a guitar. Small islands of wounded men dotted the sand. Passing troops noticed that those who could sat bolt upright as though now immune to any further hurt. They were quiet men, seemingly oblivious to the sights and sounds around them. Staff Sergeant Alfred Eigenberg, a medic attached to the 6th Engineers Special Brigade, remembers a terrible politeness among the more seriously injured. In his first few minutes on the beach, Eigenberg found so many wounded that he did not know where to start or with whom. On Dog Red, he came across a young soldier sitting in the sand with his leg laid open from the knee to the pelvis as neatly as though a surgeon had done it with a scalpel. The wound was so deep that Eigenberg could clearly see the femoral artery pulsing. The soldier was in deep shock. Calmly he informed Eigenberg, "I've taken my sulfur pills and I've shaken all my sulfur powder into the wound. I'll be all right, won't I?" The 19-year-old Eigenberg didn't quite know what to say. He gave the soldier a shot of morphine and told him, "Sure, you'll be all right." Then, folding the neatly sliced halves of the man's leg together, Eigenberg did the only thing he could think of. He carefully closed the wound with safety pins. Into the chaos, confusion, and death on the beach poured the men of the 3rd wave, and stopped. Minutes later the 4th wave came in, and they stopped. Men lay shoulder to shoulder on the sands, stones, and shale. They crouched down behind obstacles. They sheltered among the bodies of the dead. Pinned down by the enemy fire which they had expected to be neutralized, confused by their landings in the wrong sectors, bewildered by the absence of the sheltering craters they had expected from the Air Force bombing, and shocked by the devastation and death all around them, the men froze on the beaches. They seemed in the grip of a strange paralysis. Overwhelmed by it all, some men believed the day was lost. Technical Sergeant William McClintock of the 741st Tank Battalion came upon a man sitting at the edge of the water, seemingly unaware of the machine gun fire which rippled all over the area. He sat there, throwing stones into the water and softly crying as if his heart would break. The shock would not last long. Even now a few men here and there, realizing that to stay on the beach meant certain death, were on their feet and moving.